Great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That was one of the unintended consequences of making you the host. Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, well then, if everyone, thank you to everyone who's put your name and organization in the chat, so we can make sure we record it and know everyone who's in the room. And then I am going to turn it over to Mache from New Ecology to share this presentation on the Massachusetts, the updated code. We're really excited to get to learn about this today, and we'll have time for questions after. Mache will have about a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So please, if and as you have questions, just put them in the chat and we will make sure we respond to them at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mache.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present information on the energy code. Keep in mind this presentation is 30 minutes, and it was compressed from 2 hour-and-a-half presentations. So there's a lot of information. I'm really going to go through each slide, sort of talking through it, and then there's a lot of reference information that's really meant for you to take a look once we get to the once you get, hold on, how do I switch to the next one? There we go. Once you download the presentation and you are able to, get more out of it. So without further sort of ado, so quick history of how we got where we are. It kind of started in 1997 when we had a restructuring, which essentially separated the generation from distribution for the electricity. It created a whole bunch of markets and created the renewable portfolio standards. In 2008, there was another big law. It established net metering. It established the green communities, which we have the stretch code now. We joined the regional, the RGGI, a lot going on there. And so throughout, there was a history of code upgrades, and they've been fairly incremental. You can see in 2006, we started at about a HERS 100, and then slowly progressed where our most recent stretch code was a HERS 55. And we added Passive House and Energy Star as compliance pathways. So now, in this Act of 2021, Massachusetts did a few things. We've established a goal to be 85% carbon free by 2050, which is a big requirement. It added goals for municipal lighting plants, which were excluded from all the laws that I mentioned. And perhaps one of the most consequential shifts was that it took the legislation took the responsibility for the energy code from the BBRS, Building Regulation and Standards, to DOER, which is the Department of Energy Resources, and created an additional code. So those are sort of the big components there. So in Massachusetts, in theory, now we have 3 codes. We have 3 energy codes. We have the base code, which is going to be updated in this coming July, which is still part of BBRS, the building regulations. And that applies only to communities that never passed the stretch code, that never became green communities, which is about 52 communities. The remaining communities, the 299, I think it might be 300 now, are part of the stretch code. And the stretch code updates automatically, which it updated in January 20 of this year for residential, and July of this year will update for commercial. So without doing anything in the state, all stretch code communities will now be part of the new and more higher performant requirements stretch code. And then it created a brand new code called the specialized opt-in code. Sometimes we refer to it as net zero code. And that it has to be voted on specifically by each individual town to adopt. And we'll get into exactly what those do. So here's a quick summary. The base code, it's going to be updated to the IECC 2021 without any changes really. The stretch code, there's some key modifications, including EV ready and solar ready. And then the specialized code builds on that, has a passive house requirement for multifamilies, and also looks to electrify, which really trying to push the shift from fossil fuel burning to all electric. So first I'll talk about the residential. This is right. So the stretch code pathway, there are 3 pathways. First of all, just to make sure everyone knows now, this is again a lot of details, but generally we refer to the Massachusetts code as 780 CMR. Because it was shifted to DOER, it's a new reference, so it's 225 CMR, and 22 is the residential, and 23 is the commercial. So if you ever see those, so for residential, single family, up to 3 stories is what we're talking about here. We have the prescriptive path, which is sort of similar, that has always been. The big change there really, it requires some additional efficiency packages. So yes, you follow the prescriptive path, and then you have to make a couple other improvements. And for reference is all the information there. Option 2 hasn't really changed that much. It is still an ERI, so HERS rating. It does add balanced mechanical ventilation and energy recovery, so that's new. So all buildings following this residential pathway will have to have a energy recovery ventilator at this point, and they do have specific requirements for those efficiencies. And you are now not just required to be EV ready, but you actually have to wire for EV, right? So you have to, I guess you don't have to put in the actual charger, but you have to have, your panel has to have the breaker, and you have to have the conduit and wires to where the charger will be installed. So really, it's trying to motivate you to install this. And notice that the HERS scores will change and will depend a little bit on fuel or all electric. So for mixed fuel buildings, it used to be 55. Come January, right now it's 52. Come January 1st, it changed to 52. And then July 1, 2024, the HERS will be 42, which is a big jump. And you can see all the other ones. So there's a little bit of, there's a credit for solar, and there's a credit for all electric. And you can see on this side, what does that really mean? The bottom line here is more or less passive house. It varies, but it's sort of the average passive house HERS score of about 34, 35. And you can see we're trending way down. So we're only a few points above passive house as part of the base stretch code in Massachusetts for residential buildings. And then the third option is passive house. And I think, that's pretty self-explanatory, and you can follow that pathway. The big thing also is the existing buildings now. They are, the renovations. Historic buildings, unfortunately for me, historic buildings are still exempt. So, you're allowed to make changes that don't alter the historic fabric and may not meet the current codes. However, any additions and level, significant alterations that are not historic are now required to meet the new requirements, new performance requirements, which again, the table is probably the best way to look at it. They're slightly higher values, but you no longer can just add something and not test it or not have it perform as well. And for alterations, if you have a level 3 alterations, the entire building will have to be compliant with the new code. So if you improve more than 50% or add over 100% of additions, you will be required to meet the new code for those. So that's a big change as well. So the residential specialized code, let's dive into that really quickly. As I said, it's something that needs to be specifically voted on. Usually what's required by towns is you need to put a warrant article together, and you need to have a vote, whether it's a city council vote or town vote that needs to be actively passed. Anytime between January 1st and whenever someone votes it in, it usually the suggested timeline is 6 months, essentially what we call a concurrence period, which means it gives everyone time to adjust. I know Cambridge, Somerville, Brookline, and Watertown already passed these, so they're and they actually cut their concurrency period a little bit because they are, I believe, starting on July, even though they passed this in January, so it was not fully 6 months. The 6-month part is recommended, so not required. So you can see, and I know that there are at least 20 other communities right now that are vying to get this. It is something that DOER distributes and lets you know. However, a lot of these preliminary moves to become a specialized code municipality don't get registered because it might be like an internal committee vote or something like that. And until it's really passed by the town vote, it doesn't register. But there are at least 20 others that are in the process of doing this. Slightly different. So it's called the Appendix RC. And there are also 3 pathways. One is the zero energy pathway, which essentially means that your building uses zero energy on site on an annual basis. The one which pretty straightforward, I don't want to get into, bog down in what exactly that means, but I will point out that if you have if you have a mixed fuel building, which is allowed with zero energy pathway, the trick becomes that you actually have to offset the gas use with your PV. So in some respect, you're generating, so in practice, one would be generating more electricity than can be actually used by the electrical uses in the building. So you become a net exporter, which I think is a way to sort of encourage full electrification because you can't really monetize the excess solar that you're producing, and RECs or offsite renewables are not allowed. This has to be on site. Pathway 2 is what's called the all electric pathway. Basically, just like it says, if you are all electric, you can achieve a higher HER score, 45 versus 42. You can follow passive house. PV is not required. Wiring for EV is. And then there's the mixed fuel pathway, which means you have to go passive house or HERS 42 and wired for electric and PV required. I'll get into the wired for electric a little bit more, but just to give you a quick sense, that means that whatever appliance or system that you're installing that's gas fired must be designed and wired for future conversion. So think about that. That means that really the only difference is that you're putting some kind of an end appliance that's gas fired versus electric. So as a quick example, a gas stove in the kitchen, if somebody is really gung-ho about that, you will have the gas connection and your stove, but right behind that stove is required to be a plug that can handle an electric stove, and that has to be wired all the way to the panel, including the breaker and the whole building capacity. So just thinking about that way. Sorry, so all of that I mentioned. And then the big one, which is highlighted here, I think this is, by the way, your pre-wiring, what it means. I'm not going to get into it, but the big one is that in the specialized code, single family or townhomes over 4,000 square feet must be passive house, and all multifamily buildings over 12,000 square feet must be passive house, period. So if a town signs on to this residential specialized code, that 4,000, 12,000 breakdown is a requirement for all residential buildings. Okay. So quick, very key takeaways for the updated stretch code. We have reduced first scores, ERVs required, wiring instead of just EV ready. The Energy Star option was removed, so that's no longer an option. And then we get into the details, but there's specific passive house documentation required to get your building permit and your occupancy permit. And additions and renovations are no longer exempt. The specialized code, right there, this is a little older, so but for most part, I think no one really will get in before January 1st, but there are 4 communities that already passed it. We talked about that. So hopefully I'm good on time. Good. We'll talk a little bit about the commercial code. That's for, for most part, I think for the audience is large multifamily would be, 4 stories or higher becomes a commercial code. So the one big thing in commercial code that is completely new, it's called TEDI, which is the thermal energy demand intensity. So if you hear somebody talking about meeting a TEDI, this is what they're talking about. And there are 2 different types. There's a heating and cooling TEDI. And it essentially it represents a threshold below which a building has to be designed that DOER established that shows that the annual energy delivered to the building falls below that. It's really focused on envelope and ventilation. Same for cooling, right? So here's a quick diagram that is right from DOER's presentation. The TEDI is not an EOI, even though it has the same labels. It doesn't account for any efficiency of the heating equipment. It's literally how much energy you need in the building to counteract the exterior conditions. So it's right. So if it was gas, this value would be 90%. If it's a heat pump, it's 320. It takes that out of the equation, and it really says, with my nice envelope and great energy recovery ventilation, is my heating TEDI BTUs per square foot per year below the threshold that it needs to be. So it's a new way to measure performance of buildings. That was used in, I think it originated in Vancouver. It's used currently in Toronto. So it comes mostly from Canada, but it is a great way to make sure that your envelope is in a good place. These are just the values. I don't need to go into it. The goal is really to significantly reduce the heating component, right? So they're projecting about 85% reduction in heating load, heating TEDI from the current stretch code. And the reason that's done is for emissions. So you can see if your heating component is, as our grid is getting cleaner, if this is your gas, if the red is the gas and the gray is electric today, that's roughly what the heating requirement would be. As the grid gets cleaner, the emissions improve, except the percentage of your emissions coming from the building, coming from fossil fuels increases. So if you can eliminate that, which is what we're doing, we're then really reducing emissions by 2050. And that's the purpose behind this. Anyway, so this is one of the pathways now. So this commercial code starts in July 2021. This is very similar to residential code for commercial residential buildings. You can see it's only multifamily, and it essentially says right now we can have targeted performance, which is TEDI, that's automatic. Then we can have HERS, passive house, and then ASHRAE modeling, which is the EQuest modeling. So this EQuest goes away with the specialized code, and I'll talk later. The optional target performance also goes away, and you're really left with passive house. So we'll get to that. Okay.
Maciej, your sound is just goes in and out a little bit. So if there's any.
Sorry, maybe I'll speak more to the speaker. Is that better?
That sounds good right now, but hopefully,
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, please interrupt me if I'm not speaking well. Okay, so really there, again, several options. Well, go back where we were. In the commercial code, we have prescriptive compliance, which residential buildings cannot follow under the commercial side. So if you have a multifamily building that's, 4 stories or higher, whatever the size, you cannot do prescriptive path. That's not allowed. Targeted performance is definitely that's the TEDI. That's what we talked about. And then the relative performance is the ASHRAE, this sort of classic large building EQuest type modeling that provides a baseline and a comparative model that tells us whether something is better or not. In the past, that was a 10% improvement. Like the original stretch code had a 20% improvement over baseline. The newest one has 10% improvement over baseline. Baseline has shifted up. It's much more aggressive. So, and then we have certified performance. We always have passive house or HERS compliance option. Lots of conversation here. But generally, I'm not sure how much we need to get into it, but the TEDI option specifically lists these types of buildings: dormitory, fire, police station, library, office, school, post office, and town hall. These must follow the TEDI pathway. And also other buildings can do it as well, but don't have to. Note the big distinction here is the ventilation rate of the buildings, and that was the way to address sort of lab spaces and high ventilation buildings. So if on average your building is less than 0.5 CFM per square foot, which is all residential buildings, then you follow this. If it's higher, then you can do other pathways. So July, if you don't do the stretch code, then if you don't do specialized code, then residential buildings must use this, or they can be passive house or HERS compliance. For most part, it'll be passive house. It is we've done several models now to try to figure out how strict the TEDI requirements really are. And we just modeled a passive house pre-certified building through TEDI, and we had a very hard time passing. So I think the way the guidelines are listed right now, it'll be easier to pass compliance using passive house than it is to use the TEDI pathway. There's still a lot of discussions of what the requirements will be, and I think there'll be a new guidance coming out of DOER in the next, let's say, 4 weeks. We were submitting comments to them right now on this, along with several other design firms. But for now, the TEDI pathway seems to be more difficult than a passive house pathway. So that's a little bit of a surprise maybe, but that is where we are right now. And then this is what I said, the ASHRAE model, the Appendix G. You can see it specifically applies to the high ventilation buildings, which is greater than 0.5 CFM. So lab spaces are the big ones, really. Performance spaces or something like that would fall under this pathway, and multifamily cannot use this anymore. In the past we could. Sometimes over 100,000 square feet buildings under the previous stretch code, we were required to use that, but now we will not be allowed to use that at all. So this really applies to larger buildings, non-residential buildings, or buildings that have what's called high ventilation rates. So the key modification in this code, these codes, thermal envelope certificate is required and must be posted in the building. So that is essentially saying you need to test your buildings. No commercial buildings will be allowed to get a certificate of occupancy if it has not been tested. The other part, and the thermal envelope certificate also includes, it has to display R values for the windows, for the walls, for the roof, stuff like that. So it is meant to be really a reminder of how the building was constructed in addition to the testing result. Again, maybe not applicable to many residential buildings, but sort of glass towers, there's always been a way to get around these curtain wall systems. Now there's what's called a curtain wall backstop. And the basic premise you gotta just pay attention to is that the overall U value must be less than 0.25, which doesn't seem like much, but considering where we were, it's a big jump. So you can't now sort of have a really, really big roof and really poor windows. There's a minimum performance of these systems that are going to be required. Testing is now mandatory. Like I said, it's not, it's not passive house level. Passive house equivalent, by the way, is 0.08 CFM 75 per square foot of enclosure, but it is, again, a big step. Getting into details here, you're allowed to try to fix it if it's between 0.35 and 0.45 without destructive measures. And then if you fail it, then you have to remediate it. I talked about sampling. Sampling is sort of what we use all the time. That's part of the HERS ResNet protocols, essentially. So we're there. Energy recovery ventilation, mandatory. You cannot have a building now that's exhaust only or whatever, natural ventilation. That is no longer allowed. And it provides minimum efficiency because there are very many different types of ERVs out there. So it basically says that you have to meet a total efficiency of 75. Thermal bridge accountability, that's another one. So, there are many ways of doing this. Prescriptive modeling, using reference, but basic premise is that every thermal bridge now has to be accounted. So when you're doing your TEDI or you're doing your passive house, all the different linear thermal bridges and point thermal bridges must be accounted for. So that is great because that is one place where there's a ton of heat loss. And so that is now required. EV ready requirements are mandatory, right? So in residential group R, residential building, 20% of the spaces must be EV ready. And then for all others, 10%. And then again to the installed component versus just EV ready. So you must have installed wiring for level 2 charger for those 20% of spaces. So in theory, you don't need to have a charger at the termination of that wiring, but really, why not at that point, I think is the way that this was designed. So for practice, 20% of residential building parking lots now must have EV charging stations. So electrification is very much encouraged throughout. So you can see that with the idea of wiring for future changes, there are requirements to design in order to get a building permit. If you're using fossil fuels on site, you have to have a separate set of drawings that will actually design the equipment and the capacities and the spaces for future replacement. Yep. So that there's a lot. There's definitely a very keen focus on electrification, even if it's not absolutely required, which it is not. And just keep in mind while I'm saying this that commercial restaurants and generators are exempt from the electrification component. So if you have a kitchen, commercial kitchen and with gas, those do not count as mixed fuel. Neither do generators. There might be gas fired or even oil fired. So those are now exempt from electrification. Very similar, just slightly different time frame. You can see 4 and 5 stories. So again, we're in the commercial So every 3 stories and under is residential, 4 stories and higher is commercial. So 4 and 5 stories, we are now in passive house requirement, January 1, 2023. And then 6 stories and higher will come into play January 1, 2024. So this is the commercial specialized code. So as soon as somebody passes this code, immediately, after the 6-month wait period, up to 5 stories is going to be passive house. And then starting January of next year, it'll be all residential buildings. I don't think I need to read through this, but there's also some new definitions in the code that describe, help clarify of what's really required. So specialized code updates, pathways are very similar as to residential. So essentially, zero energy pathway in theory allows gas, but again, you have to offset both gas and electric use with solar. So you're generating more than you're probably using on site. That's probably not a big deal if somebody has a very strong feeling about gas cooking, but it does become a big deal if it's domestic hot water or heating that's gas fired, because that's a big load and you would have to offset quite a bit of that with PVs that you could not you could not monetize that PV unless you sort of schedule Z to another user. But that is an option. There's the all electric pathway, which we mentioned already, but it's the heating, ventilation, and hot water using heat pumps. You can see here in the diagrams, the one on the lower left, it's a Mitsubishi QAHV. It's a CO2 based central heat pump water heater that we're working on several projects that have designed it and are now in construction. So there are central heat pump systems available in addition to sort of the standalone self-contained heat pump tanks that you can buy in Home Depot and so forth. And then you have the heating and cooling that's pretty standard these days. Mixed fuel pathway, a few things here. Biomass is considered clean. So if you have a biomass boiler for some reason, that complies with this pathway. It does require solar, and it tells me right there 1.5 watts per square foot of the gross area of the 3 largest floors. So if you have a footprint of 10,000 feet and 20 stories, 1.5 watts times 30,000 is what you'd be required to put on the building. So that's a pretty significant requirement. Your systems have to be more efficient. So again, we have sort of the code in section 406 has the requirements for additional efficiency measures. And so there are additional requirements there. Again, with a pre-wired, right? So this is the thing. You can have a gas domestic hot water, central domestic hot water heater. The thing that you'll be required is to show that you have sufficient space in the mechanical room to add a storage tank. Usually heat pump systems have larger storage requirements, that your electric system to the building and to the panel is sufficient to replace whatever the capacities of the gas system. So it's really everything other than the actual appliance is there to be electrified. That's the code these days, right? Same with dryers. And this is the other sort of part, right? It's again trying to really push the electrification. So even if your systems, you've designed to be all electric, if your system is, domestic hot water is gas, or heating and cooling as gas, whatever it might be, as part of the building permit, you have to submit full documents, just as if you were building it, specifically stating, what type of equipment will work, how it'll be replaced, how is the electrical wiring done. So you have to demonstrate that your HVAC equipment that's installed, if it's gas fired, that it's compatible with electrification. So for example, it's, if you have, let's say, a boiler with hydronic distribution to air handlers, that you can switch to a VRF system somehow, and can either reuse those air handlers, or the idea is that you're going to have to replace those air handlers. All of that has to be considered in the drawings for the permit set, so before you're even allowed to start building it. So it's a pretty significant change, and clearly oriented towards decarbonization. And I think I mostly said this already. So I think that's it. How did I do? I was trying to go pretty fast. All right, 35 minutes. So that's it on the presentation. I know there's a lot there, and I don't know how much, I'll make this available so you can definitely read into the details, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Can I interject for 1 second, please, here? So the sound is definitely coming and going. So with the Q&A, I'm wondering if you want to try to shut off your camera and see if that helps the audio. If you try that, we'll see how it works. Thank you very much. So Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mache. And yeah, if folks can mute while you're not speaking, that'd be great. That might help as well. So there is one question in the chat that I saw, I think from Jamie, about whether there's a list of the 20 other communities planning to adopt the specialized code. I don't know if Mache or maybe Ian, I saw you on there, if you know about that.
I think Ian, I'm sure, would be better to answer that question.
Hi everyone. I actually don't have a definitive list, but our Green Communities division is sort of compiling one. So if you know of communities that are considering it, then don't assume that our Green Communities division knows. But I think they have maybe 22 communities that they're aware of right now, that are considering or in the process, or and most of those are towns that have a town meeting schedule sometime in the spring.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Others, do others have questions? Mark, do you want to ask your question out loud about the residential additions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm inquiring about the residential code, whereby if you put an addition on a building that is greater than 1,000 square feet, you must also consider the primary systems of the existing home, being heating, cooling, ventilation, air barrier, windows, etc. I just want to make sure that was a little glossed over in the beginning, and I want to make sure that we address that.
Yes. Let me get back to that one. So, so the additions, this is the part I think here. So additions shall conform to the new construction without requiring the unaltered portion of the existing building to comply. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, right?
Well, that's not clear, because if you go down a couple of bullets, it says that anything over 1,000 square feet must meet a HERS score. And a HERS score can only be applied to an entire, the definition of a dwelling unit, which includes bedrooms, bathrooms, kitchens, and all of the functions of daily life. So any addition of 1,001 square feet triggers a renovation of the existing home.
Looks like Ian has an answer to this question.
Yeah, sure. I can take this one, and good to hear you, Mark. Yeah, so this is worth highlighting and flagging, because I think it's going to be significant for for, I would say, mostly affluent homeowners, but still, it's going to catch a lot of builders by surprise, and we need to get the word out about this. But so Mark is right that that table at the bottom is showing a HERS rating requirement if you trigger either an addition that's adding more than 1,000 square feet or an alteration that's renovating more than 50% of a home and also adding more than 1,000 square feet. So in those two situations, then essentially you have to do a HERS rating on a dwelling unit. Now, if your addition is adding an accessory dwelling unit, like an in-law apartment, then it's reasonably straightforward. So you do the HERS rating on that new unit. And we think that's good public policy to make that an attractive option. But if you're just expanding an existing unit to make it a larger unit, so adding over 1,000 square feet to an existing home, then that's pushing you to then do the HERS rating on that whole home, and that's likely going to need some complicated set of additional measures on that existing home to hit that HERS rating. So we want folks to know that going in, and it is going to put pressure on HERS raters like Mark to explain this to potential clients and to architects in the field. It does account for a significant energy and greenhouse gas savings to do this, but it is it's been a little bit of a sleeper issue up until now.
It sounds like Katie may also have run into this situation then with the 600 square foot addition. I don't know if Katie, if you wanted to add anything there. If not, we can go to Talia.
So, well, hold on, before we move on, I'm sorry, Katie didn't want to voice any additional information, but the only way that you can do a HERS rating on an addition is if it also serves all of the needs of daily life, meaning that the addition, if it didn't plan to have a kitchen and bedrooms, we'll have to add them. So the implications of saying the city of Boston wants a HERS score for an addition means that you must turn that home into a duplex, and whereby you may run into zoning issues, number one, but number two, you have to build that out as a dwelling unit, according to ResNet. It's not allowable to put an addition on that doesn't have all of the components of a home. You cannot complete a HERS rating on an addition without making it a home.
Yeah, I would just clarify and say you have to have a dwelling unit to do a HERS rating. So, so that's one solution. In the case that, I guess it's Katie put in the chat, if you're doing a 600 square foot addition, that isn't going to trigger the 1,000 square foot threshold. So that would only trigger if the addition is to a existing unit that's less than 600 square feet. So if you had a 500 square foot unit and you added 600 square feet to it, then that would trigger a HERS score on the combined like 1,100 square feet. Then that starts to get a little bit easier.
Right.
So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Katie, we can't hear you, but maybe you can try taking off your headphones and try the sound in maybe a different intake. In the meantime, can we go to Talia?
I would just quickly add the second bullet point, which just says the existing building in addition comply with this code as a single building. So if you're adding 600 feet, you can still try to pass it as a whole, as a single building, as an option. It does not have to be just the addition that does this. Sorry, go ahead.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to ask my question out loud, but it's basically just what's in the chat. I'm a little confused about the solar requirements in the case of a larger than 4,000 square foot residential mixed fuel home. It sounds to me like if a builder were choosing the HERS or FIAS 0 option that they would have to put enough solar on to match the energy consumption on site. But if they couldn't do this, like if there was shading or what have you, it seems like that might not be an option in this case particularly, although I know in other situations there are some exceptions for shading. So would just love some clarification there.
So there are exceptions for shading here as well. If your roof is more than, I want to say 60% shaded, sorry, if the solar is less than 60% available, Ian, is that right? 60%?
I think it's 70.
70, or you're not oriented in the right direction, then that requirement goes away. Yeah, so it's meant to do that part. I think and then the solar requirement is in the specialized code, sometimes, and not in the base code. Just go back to that.
Yeah, maybe I can just add a little bit to that. So it's only the specialized code where the over 4,000 square foot home kicks in. And the idea is that for homes that are mixed fuel that are less than 4,000 square feet, they have to install a 4 kilowatt system. But over 4,000 square feet, we think a 4 kilowatt system is too small to meet the needs of that home. And it's generally going to be more feasible to get to HERS 0. And what size system you need to get to HERS 0 is going to depend on the home and also how the architect is designing the roof and so on. But typically you're looking at more like an 8 kilowatt system, which is about the average installed residential system size in Massachusetts. So what we're saying is those larger homes really have the opportunity to get to 0 if they're not shaded, and they should do that. Whereas smaller homes, it's a lower solar requirement.
Right, that makes sense. I guess I was thinking of a scenario with a larger home where there was shading. It sounds like the builder could just get out of that requirement and build a large mixed fuel home. That was my concern, I guess.
Yes, no, that is allowed. We do want to encourage sites with shading to still get used, whether they're shaded because they're infill developments or they're shaded because there's mature trees. Those are both good things from a public policy standpoint. So we do allow that exception.
Okay, and is it just they have to then put as much solar as is feasible in that circumstance where there is some shading?
If they're shaded more than 70%, then they don't have to put any solar.
Okay.
If they're shaded less than 70% but can't get to HERS 0, then I don't think we have clear guidance, but we can maybe add that.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's shaded less than 30%. Sorry, it's the opposite. You have to have solar availability for 70%. Right? Is that right?
No, you only have to have solar availability for 30% to trigger. But
Well,
shade is not a black and white thing, ironically. So it's full of partial shade, and we list the PV Watts tool as sort of the acceptable way of determining that. So you can get a clear answer on your site, but it's hard to explain verbally.
no, but I agree. But I think when you install your solar, you would have like a solar eye type assessment. And I think what you're saying is if that tool determines on an annual basis that you have more than 30% shaded, then you would not qualify, because that's how usually solar systems are installed, and that's been the requirement for Mass Solar and some other programs as well. So is that right, or is this completely new that if you're 70% shaded on an annual basis, you're still required it? Because I think that's a big difference. So I just want to clarify.
Yeah, let me check which way around it is. I thought it was 70% shaded gets you exemption rather than 30% shaded.
Yeah,
I will check.
Okay, please let me know, because I definitely read it the other way around, but I would very much like to know that. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Ian, also for being our guest presenter today. We appreciate you being here. Okay, well, it sounds like Katie, your sound may not work, but it sounds like you were required with the 600 square. Oh, we may be able to hear you.
I didn't mean to. I was using that to hold my screws.
Nope, that's
Yeah.
Chris. We can't hear you, Katie, but it sounds like you
I
did
think
have
I
to
emptied them all
work
out
with
into the bottom of the cabinet.
Chris, can you mute Chris?
I need the container.
Chris Winslow, architect.
They didn't need the screws.
Chris is in the middle of getting his place ready for the new stretch code. So, okay, well, I don't know.
Sorry, I was going to say that the host can mute somebody, but
Got it. Chris, looks like Chris muted himself. Okay, well, I think there's maybe no more questions. So really appreciate everyone's listening, questions, your input, your feedback here. And we will definitely, no worries, Chris, we'll definitely share the recording and the slides with everyone. And if there's additional 30% versus 70% shading clarification, Ian, would definitely appreciate that. And I just wanted to share one big announcement and then open it up if anyone had any other very timely announcements. And the one announcement we wanted to make sure everyone heard for the energy cohort is that DOER, we're excited to say, has put out their $50 million for a low and moderate income housing decarbonization grant program. So this is a mouthful, but it is very exciting. This is going to be between likely $40,000 to $50,000 per unit for significant building decarbonization. So really want to applaud DOER for their leadership on this, and really looking forward to having anyone who has projects who might be eligible for that, looking to do significant decarbonization work to apply. We'll share that PO and that grant information. And if folks want to go ahead and look at it right now, I'm just going to put that in the chat. And then if anyone has any other announcements that they want to share with the whole energy cohort, I would welcome them. You can either unmute and share right now, or you can send along to myself and Dawn, and we can share those resources with the listserv following this. So if anybody has any exciting announcements, we can hear you now. And otherwise, we will have another energy cohort next month. We're going to be looking at I believe it's Thursday, March 23rd at 1 p.m. We're going to be talking about the new Ecology, and Liz helped develop a new resilient building toolkit or guidebook. And we'll be walking through those tools. A lot of different resources have been assembled from various agencies and organizations to really help multifamily owners as they're developing properties and preserving properties, to think through how to make their property the climate ready, climate resilient, ready for the future, extreme weather, et cetera. And obviously the energy code can only help climate resiliency as well. So really all of these things working together, we're getting ready for a carbon-free future. So with that, I think.
One sec,
Go ahead,
Maji, can you please make me host?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to do that, but I think I have to stop recording before I.
Yes, well, that's actually the most important thing, is to stop recording.
You're on the
Okay.
specialized code thing? Yeah. It's good. I did some training on it in my town.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna stop recording then.
Yes, thank you.
It's complicated. Technical, a little
Dawn,
technical.